Hey guys, Mr. Moore, just gonna get our notes out and start taking some notes on the Southeast. We'll just pick up where we left off. So we've talked a little bit about the Southeast, its landforms. We've talked a little bit about its industries, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the history. So, if you would get out your notes, I have put a copy of the notes on your Schoology for you, and I really want you to just copy those notes. Try and get you guys used to taking notes in this format, which is the outline format. And we're just going to continue on, and we will go forward here and try to write clearly and organized so that you can fall back on your notes later and we can continue on and have some success when we do our reviews and our test at the end of this unit. Okay, so without any further ado, let's talk about the history of the Southeast. Okay, rocky soil made large-scale agriculture difficult in the north. Okay, they had a lot of rocks in the soil. The minerals weren't great. Some areas were good for growing, some areas weren't. Okay, so growing in large quantities became really difficult. Of course, we already talked about the fact that people had tobacco and things in the Northeast, and they were trying to grow those crops and export them back to Europe. But when people began to move to the Southeast, they found that the soil was really good. They had large flat areas where they could farm major cash crops. Okay, and what they did is they made these huge farms that we call plantations. So plantations were large-scale farms that cultivated one or two cash crops. These cash crops were grown specifically to sell in European countries. All right. So what is agriculture? Well, agriculture is farming. Okay. Obviously, the South had better conditions, longer seasons because of the weather. Okay. And obviously, in order to make money, we called them cash crops because they were grown with the intention of making money off of them. So these large plantations would grow maybe one or two things in their entire farm. Okay. All right. So what is a cash crop? Okay. Well, cash crops were specifically tobacco, rice, cotton, indigo. These were all cash crops that people used in Europe. So essentially what happened with tobacco, obviously, we know why people used tobacco. They weren't able to get it in all European countries, even though it came from Spain. Rice was another thing that people used large quantities of. Cotton was used to make clothing, make materials, okay, as we called them, textiles, right? And then, of course, indigo. Indigo was a plant that was used to help color or dye cottons. So at that time, when you saw people with like black clothing, black top hats, things like that, those were all colored by indigo. So indigo was another big one. Okay. So to grow tobacco, rice, and cotton, and the plantation economy created a tremendous need for labor in southern English America. We say English America because in the South, most of the owners of those plantations were English. Okay. Without the aid of modern machinery, human labor was necessary for planting and cultivating and harvesting these cash crops. While slaves existed in the English colonies throughout the 1600s, indentured servitude was the method of choice employed by many planters before the 1680s. So what is an indentured servant? Well, an indentured servant was someone that would come with the agreement that they were going to provide labor for a certain amount of time. So what that meant is maybe those English plantation owners would bring you over from a European country. You may have had some trouble in Europe. You may have already worked for that family in Europe. But they would give you the opportunity to come to the Southeast, and what they would do is they would put you to work. So you would work for maybe 2 or 3 years, 5 years, whatever the timeline was, and sometimes you would be paid. Other times they were just giving you a place to live with the opportunity of serving your time and essentially starting in the New World. And or they were able to give you land after that, if they chose to give you land so you could create your own farm or plantation years down the road. So that is what indentured servitude was. Now I want you to understand, these weren't just African slaves. These indentured servants were Anglo-Saxon, in other words, white people as well from Europe. It wasn't just African slaves. Okay, so that was something that they used a lot, was indentured servitude. This system provided incentives for both the master and the servant to increase the working population of what we considered the Chesapeake colonies at that time. Okay, so those southern colonies. All right. Okay, so without machines in the 1600s, the labor had to be done by hand. Okay, so this created a need for a lot of people because you had a large amount of work on these huge plantations. Okay, after the 1680s, many of the workers on the plantations were slaves that were brought from Africa. Unfortunately, they were traded for something as simple as rum. Okay, so in the South, they made sugarcane and molasses in the Northeast, and when they put those two together, they made rum, and they sent the rum to Africa on these large ships, and they would trade the rum for African slaves or money, and they would bring those slaves back across the Atlantic to the Southeast, where they were then auctioned off or sold to the highest bidder, and they would then become slaves on that plantation. Okay, so the majority of them were seen as property, not as people. Many of them were men, okay, because there was a lot of labor being done, manual labor. They didn't usually take a lot of women or families, so they separated these men from their families and took them across the oceans, and they were obviously treated poorly. Some were treated better than others, but they were considered property, so they were slaves. All right. Planting and harvesting, much of the work was done by people and animals. Okay. Around the year 1700, machines began to be developed. Okay. So people designed and built new kinds of machines to do farm work. Some machines planted large amounts of seeds quickly, or harvested crops faster and more thoroughly than was possible by hand. For example, a Massachusetts man named Eli Whitney invented a machine called the cotton gin. The cotton gin was made for processing cotton faster and easier. This increased the profit for the cotton farmers. Okay, and you guys can pause this video at any time. I'm moving kind of fast. I know you've got a lot you're going to be writing down, so pause whenever you need to, or go back if you need to, and that's fine. Okay, but the cotton gin actually made it better for harvesting cotton. Cotton is not easy to harvest. It's really rough on people's hands. Okay, so picking cotton was not an easy task. All right. Over the years, machines began to replace human workers on farms. With the help of machines, farmers planted and harvested more crops. This made farms more productive. As more and more farm work was done with machines, however, fewer people were needed to do the work on farms. This left thousands of people without work, and many moved to the cities for what we call industrial jobs. Okay, the people of the Southwest were not nearly as diverse as the people in the North. In the North, we had people from all over the European countries that were coming here to create a new life. In the South, the majority of the people there were either rich English plantation owners or the slaves who they had brought in, or the indentured servants. Okay, so there wasn't much diversity. Englishmen and African slaves. Okay, and the African slaves actually outnumbered the English plantation owners. Okay, which would become an issue later on when we talk about the Civil War. Okay, the people of the Southeast were not as diverse. In the North, you had the Dutch, the German, the Scottish, the Irish, the English. Okay, they all settled those northern colonies. The South was owned and operated primarily by what we call aristocrats. Okay, aristocrats were rich Englishmen. Okay, the fact that the South was so vast and spread out didn't create communities or cities. Okay, so these large plantations were just kind of spread out all over the place. There were no schools. Okay, very few churches, no real city to be found. If people wanted to travel, they usually traveled by horse and carriage, and it sometimes took several days to get somewhere. This meant that only the rich plantation owners' children were taught, and usually they were taught by private tutors. Okay. The small number of women in the area was due to the need for physical laborers, right? There were large divides in the class system amongst the people as well. So class system is really, we talk about like the rich, the middle class, and the poor, okay? Because we didn't have cities, there weren't any middle class jobs, which meant that there weren't any middle class people that made kind of a medium wage or a medium amount of money. Okay, so you had rich plantation owners and then slaves who were usually poor. Okay, this created some real problems in the South as well, because as people began to lose their jobs because of machines and things like that, they had no jobs for them to do or find when they lost their job. So some of those slaves began to move north so they could try and find work in the cities, or try to move to other plantations, or become indentured servants so that they could at least work to earn their own wage, or earn the ability to have their own farm eventually. All right. Okay, so that's probably plenty for today. I know there's a lot of writing on here, guys, so I'm just going to touch on a couple of points, all right? When we talk about the Southeast and its history, I want you to understand that a lot of this happened before the Revolutionary War, okay? When we start to look at the Civil War, we'll be looking at a couple 100 and some years down the road here. So that ends up bringing us to the Civil War. Once we start talking about the Civil War, we'll go through some things, and you guys are going to end up doing some research on some people that were involved in the Civil War, and we're going to give reports on those projects. So I don't want all your learning to be about Mr. Moore said this and I wrote this down and that's what I learned. I want you guys to take advantage of the opportunity to do a little self-exploring and find some information on your own, and we'll talk more about that starting tomorrow. So let me know if you have any questions. You can email me, copy the notes down as I have them, and hopefully you guys are having a great day. If you want to get some practice on your Southeast states, there's a link so that you can go into Quizlet and practice going over those states for our tests. I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye.